An open question in the wake of last Wednesday's assault on the U.S. Capitol is why weren't rioters stopped? Images flooded the internet last week of police officers badly outnumbered as domestic terrorists stormed one of the country's most important democratic symbols. But the inaction of some officers has been flagged as suspect. Now, as law enforcement agencies nationwide face threats of more violence, a wave of suspensions and terminations is raising questions about elements within the country's public safety departments. A new report from the Washington Post says police departments across the country are investigating their own officers for their proximity to or alleged involvement in the gathering that ultimately culminated in the Capitol Hill riot. Kim Bellware is a Washington Post reporter and the author of that report, and she joins me now. Kim, thanks very much for being with us. So the right to free speech is a founding principle of our country. Can you explain more about how a police officer's expression of political views might impact their employment in this situation?
Well, most police departments across the U.S., they do have the ability to exercise their right to free speech. Most departments do have policies that prohibit officers from making any kind of political speech or demonstration while in uniform, while they're out of uniform, as long as they're not violating any departmental guidelines around behavior, they're usually fine. But this incident on Wednesday is raising a lot of questions because there's definitely kind of a line between who was attending a rally and who was participating in this riot at the Capitol. And that's something that departments are now having to wade through because they're going to be looking at if a crime was committed by any officers, but also were there any non-criminal actions that might have violated departmental guidelines.
Right, and one concern raised in your article is that disciplining officers for being present at a violent riot could have unintended consequences that could harm vulnerable communities. Can you explain that?
Yeah, this is something that some legal experts and other First Amendment experts were paying attention to because, as you had just mentioned and had asked, police officers do have a right to free expression. And the argument that was raised is that if we start policing or if departments start cracking down on what demonstrations are okay, what is to say that that is not going to then come up next summer if there is a Black Lives Matter protest, if there is some kind of demonstration for whatever cause. So the concern is that being too broad about what is punishable behavior could ultimately widen the scope of that will ultimately limit speech for everybody else.
Well, how could these investigations impact the police departments themselves? Is there a sense they could affect morale or effectiveness?
There's definitely a question of morale, and with these departments, there's so many questions about who is involved. In one case, it was the police chief, it was leadership that was involved. So there are all these different considerations that departments are having to make because if some chiefs, if they are going really hard in punishing or otherwise sanctioning their officers, even for showing support. Maybe they didn't even participate. This is something we've seen out of Oakland County in California. They've warned that even officers who like things on social media that express support for the insurrection, that could run afoul of guidelines. That has the possibility of diminishing morale, but there's also for the public wants to know that they can have confidence in their police force, and they want to know that the police is supportive of the rule of law. So there's a lot of things that departments are going to have to contend with, from morale to freedom of speech for their employees.
So on this note that you just mentioned, we know that in communities of color, there is a deep distrust of law enforcement, given the history of inequality in the criminal justice system. Could these investigations in any way help restore that trust?
I mean, that's an open question right now. There was a really great article that BuzzFeed News put out that gave the perspective of Black officers who worked with the Capitol Police, and they had a completely different experience of feeling unsupported, of feeling threatened. So if there is a way that all of these investigations and questions can make departments reflect and ask really hard questions about how their actions in public and even in the semi-private privacy of social media reflect on policing at large and contribute to the lack of trust that communities, particularly communities of color, have with the police, then that could ultimately maybe yield some positive conversations and lead to the kinds of changes that we saw in civil rights protests from last summer.
All right, hopefully sparking some difficult but much needed discussions. Kim Bellware. Kim, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.